The October wind bit through Clayton Reeves's wool coat as his mare picked her way up the narrow mountain trail. Each gust carried the promise of early snow, and he pulled his hat lower, squinting against the cold. 3 days out from Denver, and the landscape had transformed from dusty plains to towering pines and granite peaks, somewhere up ahead. According to the lawyer's carefully drawn map, stood his inheritance, a cabin he'd never seen, left by an uncle he'd barely known. "Easy, Belle," he murmured as the horse stumbled on loose shale. The trail was rougher than he'd expected, barely wide enough for a single rider. Uncle Jeremiah must have valued his solitude to choose such a remote spot. Clayton had left Boston 2 months ago with little more than the clothes on his back and a deed to this mountain property. At 28, he'd spent his life bent over ledgers in his father's shipping office, suffocating in starched collars and social expectations. When word came of Jeremiah's passing and the unexpected inheritance, it felt like Providence itself had thrown open a door. His father had called him foolish. His mother had wept. But Clayton had already made up his mind. He needed space to breathe, to build something with his own hands, to live a life that meant something beyond profit margins and society dinners. The trail crested a ridge, and he pulled Belle to a stop, catching his breath at the view. The valley below stretched out like a painting, dark evergreens blanketing the slopes, a silver ribbon of creek winding through the bottom. And there, nestled against the far hillside, a structure that must be the cabin, but something was wrong. Smoke curled from the chimney, and he could make out horses in the small meadow beside it. 5 of them, by his count. His jaw tightened. Squatters. The lawyer had warned him it might happen. Remote properties often attracted drifters, especially with winter coming on. He touched the colt at his hip, a purchase made in Denver on the lawyer's advice. He'd practiced with it some, but the thought of actually using it made his stomach churn. Still, this was his land now, his fresh start. He couldn't let strangers steal it before he'd even arrived. As Belle picked her way down the switchback trail, Clayton caught something unexpected on the wind. Laughter. Women's laughter, light and genuine, floating up from the cabin. He frowned, leaning forward in the saddle. In his limited experience with the frontier, squatters were usually rough men, dangerous and territorial, but this sounded like a tea party? The trees thinned as he reached the valley floor, and the cabin came into clearer view. It was bigger than he'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone foundation, a testament to Jeremiah's craftsmanship. But it had been transformed. Crisp curtains hung in windows that gleamed clean. A vegetable garden, dormant for winter but neatly tended, stretched along one side. Firewood was stacked in precise rows under the extended eaves. Whoever these squatters were, they'd made themselves thoroughly at home. Clayton dismounted at the edge of the clearing, leading Belle forward slowly. The horses in the meadow raised their heads to watch. Good stock, he noted, well fed and groomed. Through the cabin window, he glimpsed movement, shadows passing back and forth. The laughter came again, followed by the clink of dishes. He tied Belle to a sapling and approached the door, his boots crunching on the frost-brittle grass. His hand hovered over his gun, then dropped. Whatever else they were, these people didn't sound dangerous. He raised his fist and knocked firmly. The laughter cut off instantly. He heard quick footsteps, hushed whispers, then silence. Long seconds passed before the door opened a crack, revealing a single brown eye and a slice of auburn hair. "Yes?" The woman's voice was cautious, but not fearful. Clayton straightened, trying to project more authority than he felt. "I'm Clayton Reeves. This is my property. I need to speak with whoever's in charge here." The eye studied him, taking in his Eastern clothes, his clean-shaven face, the uncertainty he couldn't quite hide. Then, unexpectedly, the door swung wide. The woman standing before him was perhaps 25, with that auburn hair pinned up in a practical style and wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better days, but she held herself like a queen. Chin raised, shoulders square. Behind her, 4 other women had risen from their seats around a rough table, their faces showing various degrees of surprise and suspicion. "Mr. Reeves, the auburn-haired woman said, her voice steady. We've been expecting you, though not quite so soon. I'm Clarabelle Morrison. Please, come in out of the cold. Clayton hesitated, then stepped inside, removing his hat. The cabin's interior was as transformed as its exterior. Jeremiah's sparse bachelor furnishings had been supplemented with handmade quilts, braided rugs, and small touches that spoke of feminine hands, dried flowers in a jar, books on a shelf he didn't remember from the inventory, the smell of fresh bread and something savory simmering on the stove. The other women watched him warily. A blonde with work-roughened hands stood nearest the stove, her green eyes flashing with what looked like anger. A younger woman, maybe 19, clutched a piece of embroidery, her delicate features marked by old grief. A dark-haired woman in spectacles sat with ledgers spread before her, her expression calculating. And near the back door stood a woman in men's trousers and a worn jacket, her hand resting casually near what Clayton recognized as a hunting knife. "Ladies," Clarabelle said, her tone carefully neutral. "This is Mr. Clayton Reeves, Jeremiah's nephew, the new owner of the cabin." "The man who's come to throw us out, you mean?" the blonde said sharply. Clarabelle shot her a warning look. "Ruby, please, let's be civilized." She turned back to Clayton. "Would you care for coffee? Mr. Reeves, you've had a long journey." Clayton found himself nodding, too overwhelmed to do otherwise. Clarabelle gestured to a chair, and he sat, feeling like he'd stumbled into someone else's life. Ruby, the angry blonde, poured coffee with movements just shy of slamming, while the others slowly returned to their seats, though their attention never left him. "I don't understand," Clayton said finally. "Who are you all? Why are you in my uncle's cabin?" Clarabelle sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "We have an arrangement with Jeremiah. Had, I should say. We've been here for nearly 8 months now." "What kind of arrangement?" The women exchanged glances. The one in spectacles spoke up. "A legal one. Mr. Reeves. We have a contract allowing us to stay through the winter in exchange for maintaining the property and providing a share of our garden produce and preserved goods." "I wasn't told about any contract." "I imagine there's quite a bit you weren't told," Clarabelle said softly. "Your uncle was a good man, Mr. Reeves. He understood that sometimes people need sanctuary. Sanctuary from what?" The silence stretched taut. The young one with the embroidery had gone pale, while Ruby's hands clenched into fists. The woman by the door shifted slightly, her stance suggesting readiness for trouble. "That's our business," Clarabelle said finally. "The question now is whether you'll honor your uncle's agreement." Clayton looked around the cabin again, seeing it with new eyes. These weren't random squatters. They'd made this place a home, cared for it, improved it, and underneath their various attitudes, he sensed something else. A watchfulness, a tension that spoke of fear held carefully in check. "I need to see this contract," he said. Violet, for that's who the woman with spectacles must be, retrieved a document from a wooden box. Clayton read it carefully. It was legitimate, written in Jeremiah's hand and properly witnessed. Room and board through winter in exchange for caretaking duties. But it was the date that caught his attention. Signed just 2 weeks before Jeremiah's death. "He knew he was dying," Clayton said quietly. "He made sure you'd be protected through the winter. He was a good man," Clarabelle repeated. "Not many would have understood our situation." Clayton set down the document. 5 women, alone in a cabin miles from the nearest town. Good horses, clean clothes, educated speech. These weren't typical frontier refugees. They were running from something, or someone. And Jeremiah had given them shelter. He thought of his comfortable life in Boston, the safety and predictability he'd fled. These women had fled something too, but he suspected their reasons were far more dire than his own restlessness. "The contract is legal," he said slowly. "And winter's nearly here. I won't turn you out." The relief in the room was palpable, though quickly hidden. Ruby's shoulders relaxed slightly, and the young one, Sadie, let out a breath she'd been holding. "But I'll need to stay as well," Clayton continued. "This is my property, my fresh start. We'll have to work out some arrangement." The women looked at each other again, communicating in that wordless way Clayton's sisters had always done. Finally, Clarabelle smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Well then, Mr. Reeves," she said, and there was something almost mischievous in her tone. "Can you survive all 5 of us in this cabin? Because I should warn you, we've gotten quite comfortable here, and we don't give up ground easily." The blonde woman, Ruby, actually laughed, and the others smiled. Even the dangerous-looking one by the door seemed to relax a fraction. Clayton looked around at them all, 5 women who'd claimed his inheritance, his new beginning. He'd come west for adventure, for something different than ledgers and social calls. It seemed he'd found it, though not at all in the way he'd expected. "I suppose we'll find out," he said, and was surprised to find himself almost smiling too. As the women returned to their evening tasks, Ruby to her cooking, Sadie to her sewing, Violet to her mysterious ledgers, Clayton sat back with his coffee and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and promising snow. But inside, the cabin was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of life and purpose. Perhaps this wasn't the solitary fresh start he'd imagined. But as he watched Clarabelle efficiently directing the dinner preparations, her movements graceful and sure, he thought it might be something better, something worth protecting. He just hoped he was up to the task. The morning sun slanted through the cabin windows, revealing dust motes dancing in the golden light. Clayton had spent his first night on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin, the creak of logs settling, the whisper of wind through pines, and the soft breathing of 5 women sleeping behind a curtain they'd strung across the back half of the cabin. Now, watching them move about their morning routines with practiced efficiency, he began to truly see who these women were. Clarabelle emerged first, her hair already pinned up, wearing a practical brown dress covered by a flour-dusted apron. She moved with quiet authority, stoking the fire and setting water to boil without waking the others. When she noticed Clayton watching from his bedroll, she nodded, but said nothing, respecting the morning quiet. Ruby was next, her blonde hair still in its nighttime braid, her movements sharp with barely contained energy. She immediately took over the cooking, her hands working the dough for biscuits with an anger that seemed perpetual. "Don't expect fancy cooking," she told Clayton without preamble. "We make do with what we have. It smells wonderful." Clayton replied honestly. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee was far superior to any trail meal he'd had. Ruby snorted, but he caught the pleased look she tried to hide. Sadie drifted out like a ghost, so quiet Clayton barely noticed until she was beside him, offering a cup of coffee with a shy smile. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly. She couldn't be more than 19, with corn silk hair and the kind of delicate beauty that probably caused her no end of trouble. "Thank you, Miss Sadie Goodwin," she whispered, then retreated to her corner where she took up yesterday's embroidery. Clayton noticed it was a piece of extraordinary skill. Birds and flowers so lifelike they seemed ready to take wing. Violet emerged with ledgers already in hand, her dark hair severely pulled back, spectacles perched on her nose. She sat up at the table with the air of someone conducting serious business. "Mr. Reeves," she said crisply, "since you'll be staying, we should discuss the financial arrangements. We've been maintaining careful records of all improvements and expenditures. Financial arrangements? Room and board, shared resources, division of labor." She opened a ledger filled with neat columns of figures. Everything must be properly documented. The last to appear was the woman he'd noticed by the door yesterday, Grace, in daylight. He could see she was older than the others, perhaps 35, with premature silver threading through her dark hair. She wore men's clothing without apology, canvas pants, a worn shirt, boots meant for hard work. She studied Clayton with eyes that had seen too much. "You know how to hunt, Eastern boy?" she asked bluntly. I've done some shooting. Her smile was skeptical. Shooting targets ain't the same as bringing down game. Winter's coming. We'll need every hand if we're to eat regular. As the women settled into their daily rhythms, Clayton began to understand the transformation of his uncle's cabin. Every corner showed evidence of their 8 months here. The rough bachelor quarters had become something entirely different. A home. Clarabelle had orchestrated it all, he realized. The curtain dividing the cabin gave the women privacy while maximizing the shared living space. Hooks along the walls held each woman's possessions in neat order. The table Jeremiah had roughly hewn now gleamed with polish and careful use. Shelves Clayton didn't remember from the inventory held preserves, dried herbs, and medical supplies. Your uncle helped with some of the improvements, Clarabelle explained, noticing his examination. He was quite handy with carpentry. He never mentioned any of this in his letters. No, I imagine he didn't. She poured herself tea, considering her words. Your uncle understood the value of discretion. Throughout the morning, Clayton observed their careful dance of cohabitation. Each woman had her sphere. Ruby ruled the kitchen with an iron fist. Violet managed supplies and finances. Grace handled the heavier outdoor work. Sadie tended to mending and the finer household tasks. And Clarabelle orchestrated it all with subtle guidance. We'll need to establish your duties as well, Clarabelle told him as they shared the midday meal. Everyone contributes. Of course. What needs doing? Grace laughed. The first genuine amusement he'd heard from her. What doesn't? Firewood needs splitting constantly. The roof has weak spots that'll need fixing before heavy snow. The horses need tending, yours included now. Hunting, when game can be found. Water hauling, fence repairs for the garden plot. I can work, Clayton said firmly. I may be from the East, but I'm not afraid of labor. We'll see, Ruby muttered, but there was less hostility in it now. That afternoon, as Clayton split wood under Grace's critical eye, he learned more about their arrangement. The women had divided the cabin's interior with remarkable ingenuity. Behind the curtain, they'd created individual spaces using wooden screens and carefully hung fabric. Each had a narrow bed and a small trunk for possessions. Jeremiah helped us build the screens, Violet explained when she came to inspect his wood pile. He said every soul needed a corner to call their own. He sounds like he was a good man. The best. Her usually stern expression softened. When we arrived here last February, we were in dire circumstances. Your uncle asked no questions, just offered shelter. The contract came later, when he realized he was sick. He wanted to ensure we'd have protection even after he was gone. Clayton paused in his work. Protection from what? Violet's face closed off immediately. That's not your concern. Mr. Reeves. As evening fell, the cabin filled with the comfortable sounds of women at their tasks. Ruby prepared supper, a hearty stew made from preserved vegetables and dried meat. Sadie worked on her embroidery by lamplight. Violet updated her ledgers. Grace cleaned her rifle with practiced movements. And Clarabelle moved between them all. A word here, a touch there. Keeping the peace. Clayton found himself oddly content to simply watch and listen. Their conversation flowed around topics he barely understood. References to places they'd been, people they'd known, carefully dancing around whatever had brought them here. You've made this place beautiful, he said suddenly, causing them all to look up. I mean it. Uncle Jeremiah lived here for years, but it never looked like this, never felt like this. A woman's touch, Ruby said with a snort, but she looked pleased. 5 women's touches, Clarabelle corrected gently. We each brought something different. Ruby brought her cooking skills and her temper, Grace said with a grin. Dodging the biscuit Ruby threw at her. Violet brought order to chaos, Sadie added softly, and Grace brought strength. Sadie brought beauty, Violet said, gesturing to the embroidered pieces that brightened the rough walls. And Clarabelle brought wisdom. We brought survival. Clarabelle said firmly, together. The word hung in the air. Together. Clayton understood then that these weren't just 5 women sharing a cabin. They were a unit, forged by whatever circumstances had driven them here. They'd created their own family, their own protection. "Well," he said carefully, "I hope I can contribute something worthwhile too." "Can you play cards?" Ruby asked suddenly. "Jeremiah taught us poker, but it's better with more players." And so Clayton found himself drawn into their evening ritual. Cards by lamplight, steaks of dried beans, conversation flowing easier as the night deepened. He learned that Violet had run a shop somewhere, though she wouldn't say where. Ruby had cooked in hotels across 3 territories. Grace had grown up on a ranch before whatever sent her here. Sadie remained mostly silent, but her rare smiles were worth gold. And Clarabelle revealed nothing of her past, only her present, the careful guardian of this unlikely family. As the fire burned low and the women prepared for bed, Clarabelle lingered, banking the coals. "You're not what I expected," she told Clayton quietly. "When we heard Jeremiah had a nephew back east, we pictured someone different." Different how? Harder, perhaps, or softer in the wrong ways. Eastern men often come west thinking they can take what they want, remake things to suit them. And instead, she studied him in the dying firelight. "Instead, you're curious, you watch and listen. That's good. That might mean we can make this work." "I want to make it work," Clayton said, surprised by how much he meant it. "This place, it's alive in a way I didn't expect, because of all of you. Life has a way of blooming in unexpected places." Clarabelle said, "Your uncle understood that. I hope you will too." She bid him good night and disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Clayton to his thoughts. He'd come west seeking solitude and a fresh start. Instead, he'd found himself in the middle of a mystery, surrounded by women who'd claimed his inheritance as their sanctuary. But as he settled into his bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the cabin, soft whispers, the settling of logs, the distant howl of a coyote, he realized he wasn't disappointed. Whatever secrets these women carried, whatever danger they fled, they'd brought life to this remote cabin. They'd made it a home, and perhaps, if he proved worthy of their trust, they'd let him share in it. Tomorrow he'd work harder, watch closer, and slowly earn his place in this unexpected family. For tonight, though, he was content to simply be here, warm and welcomed in a cabin full of mysteries and laughter. The wind rose outside, rattling the windows and promising winter's approach. But inside, all was warmth and safety. 5 women and 1 Eastern heir, all survivors in their own ways, all seeking sanctuary in a rough-hewn cabin on a Colorado mountainside. The truth came in pieces, like fragments of a broken mirror that slowly reflected a terrible whole. It started 3 days after Clayton's arrival, when Grace returned from checking her trap lines with a grim expression. "Riders," she said tersely. 3 of them, camped about 5 miles down the valley. They're not hunting." The change in the cabin was immediate. Ruby's hands stilled on her bread dough. Sadie's embroidery needle paused mid-stitch. Violet carefully set down her pen, and Clarabelle rose slowly from her chair. "Did they see you?" Clarabelle asked. "No, I know how to move unseen." Grace hung her rifle by the door. "But they're watching the trails, looking for something or someone." The women exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Clayton felt the air grow heavy with unspoken fear. "Perhaps they're just passing through," he offered. "Perhaps," Clarabelle said, but her tone suggested otherwise. That evening, as they sat down to supper, Clayton couldn't stand the tension any longer. "I need to understand what's happening here," he said. "If there's danger coming to my land, I have a right to know." Ruby slammed her cup down. "Your land? We've been—" "Ruby." Clarabelle's voice was quiet but firm. She looked at Clayton for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. You've shown us trust. Perhaps it's time we returned it." She folded her hands on the table, gathering herself. "We're running from a man named Thomas Morrison. He owns the largest ranch in 3 counties down in Wyoming Territory. He also owns the sheriff, the judge, and most of the town council in Bent Creek. What does he want with you? He believes he owns us." Violet said flatly. Through various legal mechanisms that wouldn't stand up to honest scrutiny but work just fine when you control the law. Clayton felt his jaw tighten. Slavery's been abolished. Not slavery, Grace interrupted. Something more insidious. Debt bondage, contracts of indenture, legal guardianship, marriage. The last word hung in the air like a curse. Clayton noticed Sadie had gone very pale. I'll start with myself. Clarabelle said, I was Thomas Morrison's wife. Clayton couldn't hide his surprise. Clarabelle smiled bitterly. Oh yes, the respectable Mrs. Morrison, married at 17 to seal a land deal between our fathers. For 10 years, I played the perfect rancher's wife while Thomas built his empire on brutality and corruption. When I finally tried to leave, he had me declared mentally incompetent, said I was hysterical, delusional, under territorial law. A husband can confine a mad wife indefinitely. How did you escape? Grace, Clarabelle said simply. She was my husband's ranch foreman, the only person on that spread with a conscience. Grace picked up the tale. I'd worked cattle all my life. Good at it, too. Morrison hired me despite my being a woman because I could break horses no man would touch. But I couldn't stomach what I saw there. When he locked Clarabelle in a room and started talking about sending her to an asylum, I helped her run. And the others? Ruby's laugh was harsh. Oh, we each have our own charming story. I was the hotel cook in Bent Creek. Morrison took a fancy to my cooking. And to me. When I refused his advances, he suddenly discovered I owed the hotel money for broken dishes and stolen supplies. The sheriff arrested me. The judge convicted me, and I was sentenced to work off my debt at Morrison's ranch. That's illegal. That's Morrison. Violet interrupted. I kept the books for the general store. I noticed discrepancies in the accounts. Shipments paid for but never delivered. Taxes collected but never sent to the territory. When I tried to report it, I discovered Morrison was behind it all. He offered me a choice, marriage to his nephew and silence, or prison for the theft he'd framed me for. Clayton turned to Sadie, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. You don't have to, Clarabelle began. No, Sadie whispered. He should know. She raised her chin with a visible effort. My parents died of fever when I was 15. Morrison was appointed my guardian. He had a judge declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs. My parents had left me a small inheritance and their farm. Morrison wanted both. He also wanted me. Said when I turned 18, we'd marry and combine our properties. I ran the day before my 18th birthday. The rage building in Clayton's chest was unlike anything he'd felt in his civilized Eastern life. This man is a monster with the law on his side, Grace said grimly. We're all legal fugitives. Clarabelle's a runaway wife who can be confined for madness. Ruby's a convicted debtor. I'm guilty of horse theft. I took 2 of Morrison's horses when we fled, including Clarabelle's own mare. Violet's wanted for embezzlement, and Sadie's a runaway ward. But surely there must be honest law somewhere. Where? Ruby demanded. The territorial marshal is Morrison's cousin. The nearest federal judge is 200 miles away, and wouldn't hear cases involving women's domestic issues anyway. Morrison owns half of Wyoming and has influence stretching into Colorado. Clayton stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The peaceful valley outside seemed suddenly full of shadows. So you came here? We ran for weeks, Clarabelle said softly. Hiding, starving, freezing. Grace knew these mountains from her wandering years. She remembered an old trapper's cabin up here. We arrived more dead than alive, and Jeremiah took you in. He was splitting wood when we rode up, Sadie whispered. 5 desperate women on 3 horses. He took one look at us and said, well, I'd better put more beans in the pot. Despite everything, Clayton smiled at that. It sounded like the uncle he barely remembered. He never asked questions, Violet added. Just gave us shelter, helped us make this place livable. When riders came looking in the spring, he told them he'd seen no one. When Morrison himself showed up in June. Morrison was here? Clayton's hand moved instinctively to his gun. With 6 men, Grace confirmed. Your uncle met them with a shotgun across his arm, told Morrison this was his land, And he'd seen no women. Morrison threatened him. Said harboring fugitives was a hanging offense. Jeremiah just spat tobacco juice at his horse's feet and said Morrison was welcome to try proving it. That's when he made the contract. Clarabelle explained. He knew he was dying. The consumption was getting worse. He wanted to ensure we'd have legal protection even after he passed. A legitimate caretaker's contract that would hold up in court. Clayton returned to his seat, his mind racing. And now Morrison's men are in the valley again. Winter's coming, Grace said. He knows we'll need shelter. He's probably checking every cabin and mine shack in a 100-mile radius. We should have kept moving, Ruby said bitterly. Shouldn't have stayed so long in one place. Where would we go? Violet asked. California? Oregon? You think Morrison's reach doesn't extend that far? You think there's anywhere in this country where women like us can just disappear? There has to be something we can do, Clayton said. Some way to fight back legally. With what proof? Clarabelle asked gently. Our word against his. 5 fugitive women against the most powerful man in the territory. Clayton felt the weight of their despair, but also their resilience. They'd survived this long through cleverness and mutual support. They'd made this cabin a fortress of sorts, a place where they could pretend, at least for a while, to be free. What will you do if he comes here? The women exchanged glances again. It was Grace who answered. We've discussed it. We won't go back. Any of us. We'll fight if we have to. You could die. There are worse things than dying, Sadie whispered, and the others nodded agreement. Clayton stood again, but this time with purpose. Then we'd better prepare. Grace, show me these riders camped tomorrow. I want to know what we're dealing with. Violet, go through those ledgers and find anything that might serve as evidence of Morrison's corruption. Ruby, take inventory of our supplies. If we're besieged, we need to know how long we can last. What are you doing? Clarabelle asked. What my uncle would do. Clayton said firmly. Protecting what's mine. And that includes all of you now. You're under my roof, on my land. That makes you my responsibility. You don't understand the risk. Clarabelle began. I understand enough. I understand that 5 brave women have made my inheritance into a home. I understand that you've been fighting alone for too long. And I understand that my uncle thought you were worth protecting. That's sufficient for me. Ruby was the first to break the silence that followed. Well, you've got more backbone than I credited, Eastern boy. The question is, Grace said practically, do you know how to use that gun you're wearing? I'm learning. You'll need to learn faster. Morrison doesn't send lawyers to negotiate. As the women dispersed to their evening tasks, Clarabelle lingered near Clayton. You could ride away, she said quietly. Head to Denver, sell the cabin from there. No one would blame you for avoiding this trouble. Would you run if you were in my position? She smiled sadly. I did run, remember? No, Clayton corrected. You survived. You escaped injustice and found others who needed the same sanctuary. You built something here, a family, a home. I won't let Morrison destroy that. You're very like your uncle, Clarabelle said. He had the same stubborn streak when it came to justice. That night, Clayton lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about the stories he'd heard. 5 women, each carrying scars from Morrison's greed and cruelty. Each had found the others in their darkest moment, creating light in the wilderness. He thought of his comfortable Boston life, where the greatest injustice he'd faced was boredom. These women had faced real evil and survived through courage and cunning. They deserved better than to spend their lives running. Through the curtain, he heard whispers, the women talking quietly among themselves, planning, worrying, supporting each other as they'd done for months. Tomorrow he'd scout with Grace, begin preparing defenses. But tonight, he simply listened to the sound of survivors refusing to surrender, and felt honored to stand with them. The knock came at sunset, 3 measured raps that echoed like gunshots in the tense silence of the cabin. Clayton had been cleaning his rifle while Grace showed him the finer points of maintenance. The women had spent the day in careful preparation, Ruby preserving what food she could, Violet organizing their legal documents, Sadie mending clothes with shaking hands. Clarabelle had maintained her usual calm, but Clayton noticed how often her eyes strayed to the windows. Now, as the knock reverberated through the cabin, everyone froze. "Positions," Grace said quietly, moving toward the back door. Ruby grabbed a cast-iron pan, a weapon as much as a cooking tool in her capable hands. Violet swept the documents into a hidden compartment under the floorboards. Sadie pressed herself into the corner, trying to become invisible. Clayton checked his gun and moved to the door. Clarabelle beside him. "Who's there?" he called out. "Thomas Morrison," came the reply. "Smooth as aged whiskey and just as likely to burn. I'd like a word with the owner of this property." Clayton glanced at Clarabelle, whose face had gone marble pale but determined. She nodded slightly. He opened the door. Thomas Morrison stood on the threshold like a man who owned the world, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through dark hair and a mustache waxed to perfection. His clothes spoke of money: fine wool coat, polished boots, a gold watch chain glinting in the dying light. But it was his eyes that made Clayton's skin crawl, cold gray, like winter sky before a killing frost. Behind Morrison stood 3 men, all armed, all watching the cabin with predatory patience. "Mr. Reeves, I presume." Morrison's smile didn't reach those frigid eyes. "I apologize for the late hour, but I'm searching for some missing property." "Property?" Clayton kept his voice level. "Livestock, you might say. 5 head that wandered off from my ranch down in Wyoming. I've been checking all the spreads in the area." Clayton felt Clarabelle stiffen beside him, but kept his own expression neutral. "Haven't seen any stray cattle up here, Mr. Morrison, Thomas Morrison, and I wasn't talking about cattle." The man's gaze slid past Clayton to Clarabelle. "Hello, my dear. You're looking well, considering—" "Mr. Morrison," Clayton said, stepping slightly to block the man's view. "This is my land. These people are here under a legal contract as caretakers." "People?" Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass. "Is that what they told you? These are fugitives. Mr. Reeves, this woman is my wife, bound by law and God to return with me. The others are thieves and contract breakers." "I have seen no evidence of that." "Haven't you?" Morrison pulled papers from his coat. "Marriage certificate. Warrant for Ruby McKenna. Debtor. Warrant for Violet Smith. Embezzlement. Warrant for Grace Hunter. Horse theft. And legal guardianship papers for young Sadie Goodwin." Clayton didn't take the papers. "Interesting how all these women happen to commit crimes that put them in your power." Morrison's affable mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something darker beneath. "Are you suggesting I'm lying, boy?" "I'm suggesting that frontier justice can be flexible when one man owns the judge." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's men shifted slightly, hands moving toward weapons. "Careful. Mr. Reeves," Morrison said softly. "You're new here, from back east. I hear you don't understand how things work in the territories. Men who harbor fugitives face serious consequences. And men who abuse the law." Morrison smiled again, colder than before. "Who defines abuse? The law is what men like me make it. Son, I own 10,000 acres, employ 100 men, ship cattle to 3 states. What do you own? A cabin and a deed from a dead man?" Clayton felt his temper rising, but Clarabelle's light touch on his arm steadied him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not going back with you, Thomas." Morrison's eyes snapped to her. "You don't have a choice, my dear. You're ill, not in your right mind. It's my duty as your husband to see you get proper care." "There's nothing wrong with my mind. The court says otherwise. Doctor, Hartley was quite clear in his diagnosis. Hysteria, delusions of persecution, moral deviation. You need treatment." "Doctor, Hartley was paid to say whatever you told him." Clarabelle replied steadily. Morrison shook his head with false sadness. "You see? Delusions. You've infected these other poor women with your madness, convinced them to run from their lawful obligations. But I'm a patient man. Come home now, all of you, and we'll forget this unpleasantness." "No." The word came from behind Clayton. Sadie had stepped out of her corner, trembling but defiant. "I won't go back. I won't marry you." Morrison's gaze turned to her, and something hungry flickered in those cold eyes. "Little Sadie, you've grown even prettier. What a shame you've been living rough like this. A girl of your delicate nature needs proper protection." "She has protection," Clayton said firmly. "From you?" Morrison laughed. "An Eastern boy playing at frontier life? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Son, I have friends from here to Denver. Judges, marshals, businessmen. Cross me, and you'll find life in these mountains very difficult." Grace appeared in the doorway, rifle cradled casually in her arms. "Everything all right? Clayton?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Grace Hunter. I should have known you'd be here, still playing the man. I see. That's what comes of letting women wear trousers. They forget their place. My place is wherever I choose to make it," Grace replied evenly. "Your place is at the end of a rope if I have anything to say about it. Horse theft is a hanging offense. Those horses were Clarabelle's, wedding gifts from her father. The law says a wife's property belongs to her husband. You stole from me." The debate might have continued, but Ruby pushed forward, still clutching her pan. "Why don't you just say what you really want, Morrison? Stop dancing around with legal talk." Morrison's composure cracked slightly. "What I want is what's mine, what law and society grant me. These contracts, these arrangements, they're the foundation of civilization. When people break them, chaos follows. When contracts are built on lies and force, they deserve to be broken," Violet said from inside the cabin. Morrison's face darkened. "I've been patient, reasonable, but my patience has limits." He looked directly at Clayton. "You have until dawn to consider your position. Mr. Reeves. These women leave with me voluntarily, or I return with the sheriff and a posse. Your choice whether this ends peaceful or otherwise." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise. Ask anyone in the territory. Thomas Morrison keeps his promises." He tipped his hat mockingly to Clarabelle. "Until dawn. My dear, I suggest you all make peace with your decision." He turned and walked away, his men falling in behind him. They mounted their horses and rode off into the gathering darkness. But Clayton noticed one rider split off, likely to watch the cabin. Inside, the women stood in a tight group, fear and defiance warring on their faces. "He means it," Clarabelle said quietly. "He'll bring armed men, maybe even a badge to make it look legal. Then we fight," Grace said grimly. "Against a posse? We'll be slaughtered." "Better than going back," Ruby said fiercely. Clayton moved to the window, watching the darkness where Morrison had disappeared. His mind raced through options, each worse than the last. They could run, but where? And how far would 5 women and 1 man get with Morrison's resources hunting them? "There has to be another way," he muttered. "There isn't," Clarabelle said sadly. "I've known Thomas for 13 years. He doesn't bluff, and he doesn't forgive. By sheltering us, you've made yourself his enemy." "Then I've chosen the right enemies," Clayton replied firmly. Sadie began to cry silently, and Ruby wrapped an arm around her. Violet had returned to her hidden documents, searching for something, anything that might help. Grace began checking weapons, counting ammunition. "Wait," Clayton said suddenly. "He made a mistake." "What?" "He threatened me, publicly. His men heard it. If anything happens to us now, there are witnesses that he was here making threats. His men won't testify against him." Grace said, "Maybe not, but it creates doubt. And doubt might be enough to bring in federal marshals, territorial investigators, men Morrison doesn't own." Clarabelle shook her head. "You're grasping at straws." "Maybe, but it's better than giving up." Clayton turned to face them all. "I need you to tell me everything. Every crime Morrison's committed. Every person he's wronged. Every dirty deal. Violet, you mentioned discrepancies in accounts. Do you have proof?" "Some," Violet admitted. "Hidden in my belongings, but without access to the full books." "It's a start. We have until dawn. Let's use that time." As the women gathered around the table, pooling their knowledge of Morrison's crimes, Clayton felt the weight of the moment. 5 lives hung in the balance. 6, counting his own. By dawn, they'd have to make a choice that would echo through all their futures. Outside, snow began to fall, the first real storm of winter. Clayton watched the flakes swirl past the window and thought of Morrison out there in the darkness, so certain of his power. But certainty could be a weakness too. Overconfident men made mistakes. He just had to find Morrison's mistake before dawn broke over the mountains. The lamp burned low as midnight approached, casting dancing shadows across the papers spread on the table. Violet had retrieved her hidden documents from a cleverly concealed pouch sewn into her mattress. And now the evidence of Morrison's corruption lay before them like pieces of a dark puzzle. "Look here." Violet pointed to a column of figures. "These are shipments of cattle supposedly sold to the army at Fort Laramie. But see these dates? They correspond with Indian raids that destroyed several smaller ranches. Morrison was selling his neighbors stolen cattle." Clayton studied the ledger entries. "Can we prove the cattle were stolen? I have bills of sale from the original owners before they were burned out." Violet produced more papers. Morrison always swooped in after, offering to buy their land for pennies on the dollar. When they refused, more raids. Grace finished grimly. "I remember now. The Hendricks family, the Carters, always the same pattern." Ruby leaned forward. "There's more. That hotel where I worked, Morrison owned it through a false company. He'd charge travelers inflated prices, then have his tame sheriff arrest them for debt when they couldn't pay. Their belongings would be seized and sold. I kept records," Violet added, pulling out another sheet. 43 travelers in 18 months. Combined value of seized property, over $8,000. Sadie, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. "The marriage contracts." Everyone turned to look at her. She continued, voice shaking. "Morrison didn't just want to marry me. There were others. Girls whose families owed him money or whose fathers died. He'd swoop in, claim guardianship or demand payment, then offer marriage as the solution." "How many?" Clarabelle asked gently. "At least 6 that I knew of, some as young as 15. Sadie's hands clenched. Emily Patterson threw herself in the river rather than married him. Morrison claimed she was unstable, used it as evidence that young women needed firm guidance. Clayton felt sick. Each revelation painted Morrison not just as corrupt, but as a predator who had built a system to feed his appetites for power and control. "There's something else," Clarabelle said quietly. She reached into her bodice and withdrew something Clayton hadn't expected, a small silver locket. "Thomas told everyone his first wife died of fever, but Margaret Morrison is very much alive." The room went still. "She's living with her sister in California under her maiden name." Clarabelle continued. "Thomas divorced her secretly, or rather, he had the marriage annulled by claiming it was never consummated. Then he destroyed the records and told everyone she died. But Margaret kept this, her wedding locket with both their pictures." Clayton examined the locket. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, a younger Morrison and a dark-haired woman with sad eyes. On the back, engraved, T.M. to M.S.S., United in God's Eyes, June 12, 1862. "This proves he's a bigamist," Clayton said excitedly. "Your marriage to him is invalid, only if Margaret will testify." Clarabelle said, "She's terrified of him. It took me months to track her down, and she only spoke to me because she knew what I was suffering." Grace had been pacing by the window. Now she stopped. "We're building a case, but who do we present it to? Morrison owns the local law. The territorial governor," Clayton suggested. "Or a federal marshal. Both 2 weeks' ride away," Violet pointed out. "And Morrison has friends there too." They continued working through the evidence, building their case. Ruby revealed that Morrison had been skimming from government beef contracts. Grace knew of water rights he'd stolen through forged documents. Each woman added another piece to the picture of systemic corruption. As the hours passed, Clayton began to see the shape of something larger. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt rancher, he was building a criminal empire, using the law as his weapon and women as his currency. "Wait," Clayton said suddenly. "The army contracts, Violet. You said he was selling to Fort Laramie?" "Yes, why?" "My uncle mentioned Fort Laramie in one of his letters, said he had a friend there from his trapping days. Colonel James Hutchinson." Hope flickered in Clarabelle's eyes. "Military justice operates outside local law." "Exactly. If we can prove Morrison's been defrauding the army." Clayton trailed off, thinking fast. "Grace, you said one of Morrison's men is watching the cabin. Posted himself on the ridge. I can see his fire from here." "Good. Let him watch." Clayton began gathering the most damning documents. "At first light, I'll ride out, openly. He'll report to Morrison that I've abandoned you." "You're leaving?" Sadie's voice was small. "Only to get help. Morrison expects me to cave or fight. He won't expect me to outflank him." Clayton looked at each woman. "Can you hold out for a week? Maybe 2? He'll come for us the moment you're gone." Ruby protested. "No," Clarabelle said slowly, understanding. "He won't, not immediately. He'll want to savor his victory. Make us sweat. Thomas always did enjoy the anticipation more than the conquest. I'll leave at dawn, right when Morrison expects his answer." Clayton continued. "He'll think I'm running scared. By the time he realizes I've gone for help, I'll be halfway to Fort Laramie." Grace nodded approvingly. "It might work. But you'll need proof you can carry. Documents can be forged, dismissed." "The locket," Clarabelle said, removing it. "Margaret told me Colonel Hutchinson knew her. He attended their wedding. He'll recognize this and know what Morrison did." Clayton took the locket reverently. Such a small thing to bring down a powerful man. But combined with the documents, it might be enough. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Violet created copies of the most important ledger entries. Ruby packed provisions for Clayton's journey. Grace sketched a map of the fastest route to Fort Laramie, including places to hide if pursued. Sadie approached Clayton shyly. "Here," she said, pressing something into his hand. It was an embroidered handkerchief, beautifully worked with his initials. "I made it earlier, for luck." "When did you—" "I'm quick with a needle." She smiled tremulously. "Don't let him win, Mr. Reeves. We've run far enough." As dawn approached, painting the mountains pink and gold, Clayton prepared to leave. The women gathered at the door, their faces showing fear but also determination. "If Morrison comes before I return," he began, "we'll handle him," Grace said firmly. "Wouldn't be the first time we've had to defend ourselves. Besides," Ruby added with a grim smile, "he wants us alive and unmarked. Gives us an advantage he won't expect us to use." Clarabelle took Clayton's hands. "Be careful. Thomas has a long reach. So does justice, when properly directed." He squeezed her hands gently. "Hold fast. I'll bring help." He mounted Belle and rode out openly, making sure Morrison's watcher could see him clearly. As he passed the ridge, he caught a glimpse of movement, the spy hurrying to report. The trail down the mountain had never seemed longer. Each hoofbeat took him farther from the cabin and the women who'd become, in just a few short days, his responsibility, his family, in a way. He thought of Morrison's smug certainty, his casual cruelty, his assumption that power meant ownership. The man had built his empire on the suffering of others, particularly women he saw as property. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened the wrong cabin, sheltering the wrong women, protected by the wrong man. Clayton might be new to the frontier, but he understood one thing Morrison didn't. Sometimes the law needed help finding justice. The documents in his saddlebags felt heavier than gold. Each ledger entry, each testimony, each piece of evidence was a weapon against Morrison's empire. And the locket, that small, silver proof of a discarded wife, might be the sharpest weapon of all. As Belle carried him toward Fort Laramie and hope, Clayton allowed himself one look back. The cabin sat peaceful in the morning light, smoke rising from the chimney. From this distance, it looked like any other homestead, but he knew better. Inside were 5 women preparing for war, armed with courage and the determination to never again be anyone's property. Morrison thought dawn would bring his victory. Instead, it had brought the beginning of his downfall. Clayton urged Bell to a faster pace. Time was now their enemy, and he had promises to keep. The race for justice had begun. The snow fell harder as Morrison returned with 8 men, their horses steaming in the cold morning air. From the cabin window, Grace counted them through her rifle scope. Morrison himself, Sheriff Dawkins from Bent Creek, and 6 deputized ranch hands, all armed. "They're taking their time," she reported, "making sure we see their numbers." Clarabelle stood straight backed at the table, her hands folded calmly, though her knuckles were white. Thomas always did enjoy a show of force. The women had spent the week since Clayton's departure preparing. Every window was barricaded with thick planks, leaving only shooting slots. Water barrels stood filled against a siege. Ammunition was divided between defensive positions, but they all knew their preparations were mostly symbolic. 9 armed men could take the cabin if they were determined enough. Morrison dismounted 50 yards from the cabin, his men spreading out in a semicircle. He wore a thick fur coat against the snow, looking every inch the prosperous rancher rather than the predator they knew him to be. "Ladies," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the storm, "I've brought Sheriff Dawkins. As promised, we can do this legally and peacefully. Simply come out, and we'll sort this matter before the law." "Your bought law," Ruby muttered, gripping her cast-iron pan like a weapon. Through the door slot, Clarabelle called back, "We see no legal authority here. Thomas, only your hired guns." Sheriff Dawkins, a thin man with a drooping mustache, stepped forward. "I have warrants, Mrs. Morrison, legal and proper. You ladies come peaceful-like, and I guarantee safe passage to trial." "Trial?" Grace laughed harshly. "In Morrison's town, before Morrison's judge." The sheriff's face darkened. "You questioning my authority, woman?" "I'm questioning your integrity," Grace replied evenly. Morrison raised a hand, silencing the sheriff. "Enough games. Clarabelle, you have 1 minute to come out, all of you. My patience is exhausted." "Then you'll have to come in and take us," Clarabelle replied. Morrison smiled coldly. So be it. He nodded to his men, who began advancing on foot, using their horses as shields. The women took their positions, Grace at the front window with her rifle, Ruby by the side door with a shotgun they'd found in Jeremiah's things, Violet watching the back. Sadie huddled in the corner with extra ammunition, while Clarabelle stood ready with Clayton's uncle's old revolver. "Remember," Clarabelle said quietly, "we don't have to win. We just have to survive long enough." The first shot came from Morrison's men, splintering wood above the window. Grace returned fire, her shot striking close enough to send a man diving for cover. The siege had begun. What followed was not the dramatic battle of dime novels, but something grimmer, a slow, grinding assault. Morrison's men fired steadily, trying to pin the defenders down while others crept closer. Grace proved their best shot, keeping the attackers at bay with careful, measured fire. "Ammunition," she called, and Sadie scrambled forward with cartridges. Staying low, Ruby's shotgun boomed, driving back 2 men who'd reached the side of the cabin. "They're trying to get to the windows." The cabin filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of powder. Through it all, Morrison's voice carried, directing his men with cold efficiency. "The roof!" Violet suddenly shouted. "Someone's on the roof!" They heard boots scraping on shingles, then the sound of someone working at the chimney. "They're trying to smoke us out," Grace realized. "Sadie, the water buckets," Clarabelle ordered. The girl ran to douse the fire just as something blocked the chimney, sending smoke billowing back into the room. Coughing, eyes streaming, the women fought on, but their ammunition was running low, and Morrison's men were getting bolder. One managed to smash a window board before Ruby drove him back with a blast of buckshot. Then, just as their situation seemed most desperate, Grace spotted something through the smoke and snow. "Riders coming up the trail. 6, no, 8 of them." Morrison's men had seen them too. There was shouting, confusion, men running for better positions. Through the chaos, a clear military voice rang out. "This is Colonel James Hutchinson. United States Army. All parties will cease fire immediately." The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Through the swirling snow, Clayton appeared beside the colonel, along with 6 mounted soldiers in blue uniforms. Morrison stepped forward, his composure cracking for the first time. "Colonel, these women are fugitives. We're conducting a legal arrest." "Are you now?" Colonel Hutchinson dismounted slowly. He was an older man, gray-bearded and weather-beaten, but his bearing commanded respect. "Mr. Reeves here has shown me some very interesting documents. Morrison, including evidence of fraud against the United States Army." "That's absurd. Is it?" The colonel pulled out a familiar silver locket. "Tell me, Morrison, how is your wife? Your first wife. That is, Margaret sends her regards. By the way, she's been living with her sister, Mrs. Adelaide Forsyth, in Sacramento. Imagine my surprise to learn she's alive, considering you told everyone she died of fever." Morrison's face had gone pale. That's a private matter. Bigamy is hardly private. Neither is defrauding the Army of $40,000 through false cattle deliveries." The colonel's voice hardened. "Sergeant Mills, place Mr. Morrison under arrest." "You can't," Morrison sputtered. "Sheriff Dawkins, do something." The sheriff looked between Morrison and the federal soldiers. Calculating rapidly. Self-preservation 1. "I'm just here serving warrants. Colonel, if the Army has jurisdiction—" "Oh, we do," Hutchinson assured him. "And those warrants of yours, I'll want to examine them closely. Amazing how many seem to involve women who refused Morrison's advances or threatened his business interests." As the soldiers moved to arrest Morrison, he made one last desperate play. "Clarabelle, tell them you're my wife. You belong with me." Clarabelle emerged from the cabin, smoke-stained but dignified. "I was never your wife. Thomas, a marriage built on lies and force is no marriage at all. You took vows, under duress, to a man who had already discarded one wife." She held her head high. "Whatever hold you thought you had over me, over all of us, is finished." The other women emerged slowly, Ruby still clutching her pan, Grace with her rifle, Violet helping Sadie, who was shaking with reaction. They stood together in the snow, 5 women who'd survived yet another battle. Morrison lunged suddenly, not at the soldiers but at Sadie, perhaps thinking a hostage might save him. But Clayton was faster, stepping between them and landing a solid punch that sent Morrison sprawling in the snow. "Touch any of them again," Clayton said quietly, "and Army custody will be the least of your concerns." Colonel Hutchinson nodded approvingly. "Sergeant, get him out of here. We'll continue to Fort Laramie for a proper military trial." He turned to the women. "Ladies, Mr. Reeves has shared your testimonies. Rest assured, justice will be served. Morrison's empire is finished." As the soldiers led Morrison away, he turned for one last look at Clarabelle. "You've ruined everything," he snarled. "No, Thomas," she replied calmly. "I've set things right." Sheriff Dawkins tried to slink away with his men, but Hutchinson stopped him. "Sheriff, I'll be recommending a full territorial investigation into law enforcement in Bent Creek. I suggest you prepare your records." As the various parties departed, leaving trampled snow and the acrid smell of gunpowder, the women stood in a tight group, hardly believing it was over. "You came back," Sadie said to Clayton, tears streaming down her face. "You actually came back. I promised I would." He looked at each of them, these remarkable women who'd trusted him, fought beside him, become his family. "The colonel will ensure Morrison faces federal charges. The evidence is overwhelming. You're free." "Free," Ruby repeated, as if tasting the word. Then she laughed, wild and joyous. "We're free." They retreated into the cabin to tend wounds, miraculously minor, and begin cleaning up the siege damage. Colonel Hutchinson joined them for coffee before departing, assuring them of the Army's protection during the trial, Jeremiah would be proud, the colonel told Clayton privately. He always said this cabin would shelter those who needed it most. Seems he was right. As evening fell, the women worked together to repair their home, boarding windows and scrubbing away smoke stains. But there was a lightness to their movements now, a joy that hadn't been there before. "What will you all do now?" Clayton asked as they shared supper. "You're free to go anywhere." The women exchanged glances. It was Clarabelle who answered. "If you'll have us," she said carefully. "We'd like to stay. This cabin, this valley, it's become home. We've built something here together." "All of us." Clayton looked around the table. "This is my land, but it's your home. You've more than earned the right to stay." "Then we stay," Grace said firmly. "Together." As they raised their cups in a toast, to freedom, to justice, to family, Clayton realized his uncle's true inheritance wasn't the cabin or the land. It was this, a place where the lost could find sanctuary, where the broken could heal, where strangers could become family. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin was warm with lamplight and laughter. Morrison's shadow no longer darkened their door. The long fight was over, and they had won not just their freedom, but their right to choose their own futures, together. Spring came early to the mountains that year, melting the heavy snows and filling the creek with a rushing water. 3 months had passed since Morrison's arrest, and the cabin had transformed from a hideout into something altogether different, a thriving homestead. Clayton paused in his work extending the horse corral, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched the changes they'd wrought together. Where once a single cabin stood, now there were signs of growth everywhere. A new chicken coop Ruby had insisted on, garden plots Sadie had laid out with mathematical precision, a proper stable Grace was helping him build for their growing herd of horses. "You're daydreaming again," Grace said, not unkindly, as she handed him a water ladle. She'd taken to wearing her hair shorter, practical for the constant work, and her face had lost some of its harsh vigilance. "Just thinking how different it all looks," Clayton admitted. "Different good or different bad?" "Good, very good." Grace smiled. "A rare sight 3 months ago. Now, increasingly common. Wait until you see what Violet's planning with that meadow. She's got it in her head to try growing wheat." As if summoned, Violet appeared from the cabin, ledgers under her arm, but dirt on her skirts from morning garden work. "Clayton, perfect timing. I need to discuss our accounts." He groaned good-naturedly. Violet had appointed herself treasurer of their small community, tracking every expense and profit with fierce dedication. What surprised him was how much profit there was to track. "The eggs Ruby's chickens are producing are selling well in town," Violet reported, settling on a stump they used as an outdoor seat. "And Sadie's embroidery work has attracted 3 new commissions from Denver." Denver? Clayton was impressed. Word of Sadie's skill had spread after the minister's wife in the nearest town had seen her work. "The stage driver has been taking pieces back and forth," Violet explained. "Which brings me to my proposal. If we pool our resources, we could purchase 2 more milk cows. The demand for butter and cheese." She continued outlining her plans while Clayton half listened, more interested in the animation in her face than the numbers. All the women had bloomed with freedom, but perhaps none more than Violet, who'd discovered she had a real gift for business when not forced to cook books for corrupt men. Ruby's voice carried from the cabin, calling them for the noon meal. As they walked back, Clayton saw Sadie in the garden, carefully tending the herbs she'd started from seeds. She stood straighter these days, the haunted look fading from her eyes. Just last week, she'd laughed, really laughed, at one of Ruby's terrible jokes. Inside, the cabin felt like a home. The bullet holes had been patched, new furniture built over the winter months. Clarabelle had insisted on proper curtains, and dried flowers brightened every corner. The large table Jeremiah had hewn now hosted 6 instead of 1 lonely man. As they gathered for lunch, Clayton noticed Margaret Morrison's locket sitting open on the mantel. Clarabelle had taken to displaying it there, a reminder of truth conquering lies. Margaret herself had testified at Morrison's trial via written deposition, helping secure his conviction for fraud and bigamy. He was serving 10 years in federal prison, his empire dismantled, his remaining legitimate assets distributed among his victims. "Letter came," Ruby announced, pulling an envelope from her apron. "From that lawyer in Denver." The women tensed slightly. Legal documents still made them nervous, even ones bearing good news. Clayton opened it, scanning quickly. "It's official. The territorial judge has vacated all the warrants against you, every one. You're no longer fugitives in any sense." The relief was palpable. Sadie actually clapped her hands, and Ruby let out a whoop that would have scandalized her hotel guests. "There's more," Clayton continued. "The judge has awarded damages. Ruby, the hotel owes you back wages plus interest. Violet, you're to receive compensation for false imprisonment. And Grace," and he looked up at her, "the horses you took were legally Clarabelle's, so no theft occurred. In fact, Morrison's estate owes you wages for your years as foreman." "What about Sadie?" Clarabelle asked. "Her inheritance has been restored, plus damages for emotional distress. She's actually quite wealthy now." Sadie went very still. "I can go anywhere," she whispered. "Do anything?" "You can," Clarabelle agreed gently. "What do you want to do?" The young woman looked around the table at the faces that had become dear to her. "I want to stay here, if that's acceptable. This is my family now." "Of course it's acceptable," Ruby said gruffly, blinking away suspicious moisture. "Who else would keep my kitchen garden from going to seed?" The conversation turned to plans, expanding the garden, improving the stable, perhaps adding another room to the cabin. But Clayton found himself watching Clarabelle, who'd been quieter than usual lately. After lunch, as the others dispersed to their tasks, he found her by the creek, standing where the water ran clearest. "You're troubled," he said. It wasn't a question. She smiled softly. "Not troubled, thoughtful. Everything's changing so fast. Sometimes I wonder if we're trying to hold on to something that was meant to be temporary." "What do you mean?" "We came together out of necessity, out of fear. Now that the fear is gone." She trailed off. Clayton understood her worry. "You think people will drift away?" "It would be natural. Ruby could find work in any hotel in the territory now. Violet could run her own business. Grace could manage any ranch. And Sadie, young, beautiful, wealthy, she could marry well, have a normal life. What about you?" Clarabelle touched the creek water, watching it flow around her fingers. "I'm 32 years old, legally divorced, notorious as the woman who brought down Thomas Morrison. My options are limited." "I disagree," Clayton said firmly. "Your options are limitless. The question is what you want." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. Over the months, working together, surviving together, something had grown between them. Not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to build something lasting here, not just a refuge, but a real community, a place where other women like us might find safety if needed, where families could grow, where the past doesn't define the future. Then let's build it." Clayton said simply, "Together." The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Then Clarabelle smiled, bright as the spring sun, and took his offered hand. When they returned to the cabin, they found the others already discussing similar ideas. Grace wanted to expand the horse operation, maybe offer riding lessons to town children. Ruby thought they could sell prepared foods to travelers on the stage route. Violet had dreams of a small school. She'd been teaching Sadie accounting, and both had discovered a love of learning. "We'll need more buildings eventually," Grace pointed out. "Can't all live in one cabin forever. The meadow past the stable would be perfect for additional houses," Violet added, already calculating. "We could create a proper settlement. Jeremiah's Landing," Sadie suggested shyly. "That's what we could call it, to honor him." The name was perfect and unanimously approved. As evening fell and they worked together preparing supper, Clayton marveled at the transformation. 6 people who'd been strangers mere months ago now moved in easy harmony, each knowing their role, each valued for their contributions. After dinner, Clarabelle produced a document. "I've been working with a lawyer," she said. "If we're to do this properly, create a real community, we need legal structure. I propose we form a company, equal shares for all 6 of us." "Equal?" Ruby looked stunned. "But Clayton owns the land, which would be worthless without all of you." Clayton interrupted. "Equal shares, equal say. That's the only way this works." They signed the papers by lamplight, creating the Jeremiah's Landing Company. It felt momentous, like a wedding of sorts, 6 people binding their futures together by choice rather than force. Later, as the others prepared for bed, Clayton stood outside looking at the stars. The mountains rose around them, protective and eternal. Somewhere a coyote called, and one of the horses nickered in response. Clarabelle joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. "No regrets?" she asked. "You came here seeking solitude." "I came here seeking purpose," he corrected. "I found it, just not how I expected." He paused, gathering courage. "Clarabelle, these past months, working beside you, seeing your strength and wisdom." "Clayton," she said gently, stopping him. "We have time now, real time. Let's not rush into anything we're not ready for." He nodded, understanding. They'd all been running for so long, from danger, from past pain, from false obligations. Now they needed to learn how to stand still, how to build rather than flee. "But," she added, stepping closer, "I'm glad you're here, glad you stayed, glad you fought for us when you could have walked away." "Where else would I go?" he asked. "This is home now." Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed warm through the windows. They could hear Ruby and Grace arguing good-naturedly about something, Violet's precise voice mediating, Sadie's gentle laughter threading through it all. "Yes," Clarabelle agreed, taking his arm as they walked back. "This is home." The morning sun painted Jeremiah's Landing in shades of gold and green as Clayton stood on the rise overlooking their small settlement. 3 months had passed since they'd signed the partnership papers, and the transformation was remarkable. Below him, smoke rose from 3 chimneys now, the original cabin, the new bunkhouse Grace and Ruby had insisted on building, and the small cottage where Sadie had set up her embroidery workshop. The garden plot stretched in neat rows, heavy with summer vegetables. The expanded corral held a dozen horses, including 2 new foals born that spring. "Admiring our empire?" Clarabelle asked. Joining him, she carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one with a smile that still made his heart skip. "Hardly an empire," Clayton replied, though he couldn't hide his pride. "But it's something. It's everything," she corrected softly. "A year ago, I was a prisoner in a gilded cage. Now look at us." The us warmed him more than the coffee. Over the months, their connection had deepened from partnership to something more profound. They'd taken Clarabelle's advice about time, letting their feelings develop naturally amidst the daily work of building their community. A shout from below drew their attention. Ruby was chasing one of her chickens that had apparently decided to explore beyond its designated area, while Grace laughed from the corral fence. Even from here, they could hear Violet calling out helpful suggestions that were making Ruby's language increasingly colorful. "We should probably intervene," Clarabelle suggested, though she was laughing too. As they walked down the hill, Clayton reflected on how each woman had grown into her freedom. Ruby had become their unofficial mayor, organizing social events and mediating disputes with gruff affection. Her cooking had gained fame along the stage route, with travelers often timing their journeys to arrive for her legendary pot roasts. Grace had proven a gifted horse trainer, her gentle methods producing mounts sought after throughout the territory. She'd also started teaching young women from town to ride, properly, in trousers, despite the initial scandal it caused. Violet had transformed from bookkeeper to business manager, her sharp mind finding opportunities everywhere. She'd negotiated contracts with the army fort for their horses, arranged distribution for Sadie's embroidery in Denver and San Francisco, and even started a small lending library with books ordered from the East. And Sadie, shy, traumatized Sadie, had blossomed most of all. Her embroidery workshop employed 3 local girls now, teaching them the trade while creating beautiful pieces that sold for impressive sums. She'd even started walking out with young Tom Harper from town, a courtship conducted under the watchful eyes of her self-appointed guardians. "Caught her," Ruby announced triumphantly, holding the errant chicken. "Though I'm half tempted to put her in the pot. This is the 3rd time this week." "She's just adventurous," Sadie said, emerging from her workshop. "Like we were." "Speaking of adventure," Grace said, a gleam in her eye. "We have visitors coming up the trail. Looks like a family, wagon, kids, the whole assembly." They gathered to watch the approaching wagon, curious but no longer fearful of strangers. Their reputation had spread. Jeremiah's Landing, the place where women could find honest work and fair treatment. The wagon contained the Miller family, James, Sarah, and 3 children ranging from 6 to 14. They looked trail-worn and nervous. "We heard about your settlement," James Miller said, hat in hand. "My Sarah, she's a seamstress, and I'm good with carpentry. We're looking for a place to settle. But most towns—" He paused, glancing at his wife. Clayton understood. The Millers were mixed race, James white, Sarah part Cherokee, and many communities would make their lives difficult. "Can you work hard and treat everyone with respect?" Clarabelle asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then welcome to Jeremiah's Landing," she said simply. "We'll help you get settled." As the women rallied to help the new arrivals, Ruby starting a meal, Grace tending their exhausted horses, Violet explaining their community structure, Clayton felt a hand slip into his. "This is what you've built," he told Clarabelle. "A place where people are judged by their character, not their past or their blood." "What we've built," she corrected. "All of us, including you." That evening, they held a celebration dinner to welcome the Millers. The main cabin, once shelter for one lonely man, now rang with conversation and laughter. The Miller children, initially shy, soon warmed to Ruby's teasing and Sadie's gentle attention. After dinner, as was their custom, they shared stories. Sarah Miller spoke hesitantly of their struggles to find acceptance, her skilled hands nervously pleating her skirt. Her husband added his own tale of trying to protect his family in a world that often didn't want them to exist together. "You'll find none of that here," Grace said firmly. "In Jeremiah's Landing, we judge folks by what they do, not who they are or where they came from." "Everyone needs sanctuary sometimes," Violet added. "We've all been refugees in our own ways." As the evening progressed, Clayton found himself watching Clarabelle. She moved through the gathering like a ship under full sail, confident and graceful. When she caught him looking, she smiled and moved to his side. "The Millers want to build near the creek," she said. "James showed me his carpentry samples. He's quite skilled. He could help us build the school Violet's been planning." "A school," Clayton mused. "Uncle Jeremiah would have loved that. Education blooming in his wilderness." "Speaking of blooming," Clarabelle said, suddenly seeming uncharacteristically nervous, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you, privately." They stepped outside into the cooling evening air. The mountains stood purple against the sunset, and somewhere an owl called its haunting note. "Clayton," Clarabelle began, then stopped, gathering her thoughts. "When I came here, I was running from a false life, a false marriage. I swore I'd never again let anyone have power over me." "I understand," Clayton said, though his heart was racing. "Do you? Because what I'm trying to say is—" She paused again, then laughed. "Oh, this is ridiculous. I've faced down armed men with less fear." She took his hands, looking directly into his eyes. "Clayton Reeves, you've shown me that partnership doesn't mean submission, that love doesn't mean ownership. These months working beside you, building this place, sharing dreams and challenges. I've come to care for you, deeply." "Clarabelle, let me finish," she said, though she was smiling. I'm not looking for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. But if you're willing, I'd like to explore what we might build together, not just as business partners, but as more. Clayton lifted her hands to his lips, kissing each one gently. I've been waiting months to hear you say that. I love you, Clarabelle Morrison. Not as a possession to be claimed, but as a partner to stand beside. Good, she whispered, stepping into his embrace. Because I have plans for us. Mr. Reeves. Big plans. Their kiss was interrupted by cheering from the cabin. Through the window, they could see their extended family, Ruby wiping tears while pretending not to, Grace grinning broadly, Violet looking satisfied as if she'd calculated this outcome, and Sadie clapping with joy. No privacy at all. Clarabelle laughed against his chest. Would you have it any other way? No, she admitted. This is perfect. They returned to the cabin to accept congratulations and gentle teasing. The Miller children, caught up in the celebration without fully understanding it, danced around the room while Ruby brought out her hidden bottle of good whiskey for toasts. As the evening wound down and people began retiring, the Millers to the bunkhouse temporarily, the women to their various dwellings, Clayton and Clarabelle remained by the dying fire. Do you remember that first night? She asked. When you arrived to find 5 strange women in your cabin? Can you survive all 5 of us? Clayton quoted, smiling. You asked if I could survive. I think the real question was whether we could thrive. And have we thrived? Clayton gestured around the cabin, at the home they'd made, the family they'd built, the community they'd started. What do you think? Clarabelle followed his gaze, seeing past the simple furnishings to the love that had transformed rough wood and stone into sanctuary. I think, she said slowly, that your Uncle Jeremiah left you more than land and a cabin. He left you the chance to create something extraordinary. He left us that chance, Clayton corrected. All of us. Outside, one of the horses whinnied softly, and they heard Grace's voice soothing it. Ruby's light still burned in the bunkhouse kitchen, probably preparing tomorrow's bread. Violet's windows showed she was likely updating her precious ledgers. And in her workshop cottage, Sadie was teaching Sarah Miller some new embroidery technique by lamplight. You know what I just realized? Clarabelle said suddenly, her eyes twinkling with mischief. What? You did survive all 5 of us. The question now is whether we can survive what we're building together. More families will come. The settlement will grow. There will be challenges we can't imagine yet. Clayton pulled her closer, feeling the solid weight of her against him, the reality of this life they'd chosen. Then we'll face them the way we always have, together. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire turn to embers, Clayton thought about the journey that had brought him here. He'd left Boston seeking solitude and found community. He'd inherited a simple cabin and helped build a settlement. He'd met 5 desperate women and discovered a family. And in Clarabelle, he'd found not just love, but a true partner, someone whose strength matched his own, whose vision expanded his horizons, whose courage inspired him daily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Millers would need help establishing themselves. The autumn harvest was approaching. Plans for the school needed finalizing. And there were rumors of a railroad spur that might come through the valley, bringing both opportunity and danger to their small community. But tonight, sitting beside the woman he loved, surrounded by the family they'd chosen, in the home they'd built, Clayton knew one thing for certain. The question was no longer whether he could survive all 5 of them in this cabin. The question was how he'd ever survived without them. Ready for bed? Clarabelle asked, standing and offering her hand. Ready for whatever comes next? Clayton replied, taking it, as they banked the fire and prepared to leave. Clarabelle turned back for one last look at the cabin, their beginning, their sanctuary, their proof that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose. Thank you, she whispered, though whether to Clayton, to Jeremiah's memory, or to the cabin itself was unclear. Then, together, hand in hand, they stepped into their future, whatever it might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. I hope you enjoyed following Clayton and the 5 remarkable women as they built their new lives at Jeremiah's Landing. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts about the story. Did you have a favorite character? What part touched you the most? Your feedback means everything, and I can't wait to share more tales of courage, love, and adventure from the American frontier with you.